Richard Soren, which is the founder and owner of Sorenex, right? It's a big exercise equipment company here in the US, based out of South Carolina, I believe, a couple hours south of me. And I don't know the era of when it would have taken place, 70s, 80s. So my dates aren't going to be good on that, but or maybe that's when the dumbbells were made and then whenever. But anyway, Richard Soren is like a grip strength legend. So Richard Soren, I believe, was like the first person to close the number 3. To my knowledge, Richard Soren is the first person to pick up York deep dish 45s and plate pinch them. So he already had like a monstrous grip, very known for, very well known for his grip. The York dumbbell handles were real thin on those early ones, and people are dropping, 100-pound dumbbells, they'd tend to bend and they would start to break off. So they weren't being cut back then for blobs. They weren't a thing. It was just dumbbells bending, and then the head would break off. So now it's just a broken dumbbell. Well, Richard Soren, being a big, strong, grip strength guy, pretty much, I think the story is he was moving some weights from one place to another, and he had that broken head of a dumbbell, which was from a first generation Fat Man, dumbbell, before it was called a Fat Man technically. And he just reached down to pick it up, and he couldn't pick it up. And for somebody that's not used to having, something stop you like that, it kind of like caught his attention. And from then he pretty much made it his goal to pick that thing up. He named it the Blob, and he kept training until he could lift that. And then he kept training until he probably did lifts with, 20 plus pounds on it, and insane feats, that are crazy. But yeah, and it was called a Fat Man because the first generation that York made with those dumbbells, the slopes bow out a little bit wider. So during that original first casting, those slopes are bigger. So that's why that first half 100 head of the dumbbell that broke off, that Richard titled the Blob, that's why it's called the Fat Man Blob. Fat Man because it's of the wider make, or the wider model, whatever you want to call it. But that's the story, man. Richard basically had a broken dumbbell in his floor, and instead of seeing it as just a broken dumbbell, he saw it as a challenge, and pretty much, created a whole new avenue for people to train grip. And it is what it is today. So if you hear anybody talk about like blobs or training blobs, there really only was one blob, and that was the Blob. That was the one Richard Soren named and lifted, and that's the reason everybody calls these other ones blobs, because of him. So that's the best origin I could give you. Maybe someday on the Grip Show, or maybe some other day, I can get him to give us that story directly from the source, and you don't have to hear it like, I don't know, 10 people down the line or something. But yeah, it was just a broken dumbbell, and you got a really strong grip guy, couldn't pick it up, challenged himself, kept training until he could pick it up, and then it just kind of became a feat of pinch strength, like pinching plates or anything else,
And what did those dumbbells, like the original ones of the Fat Man, stop being produced? Do you know what happened?
I'm not sure. York, they stopped. It's not that they stopped making them, it's that they changed the casting or the mold, so the shape of the dumbbells changed slightly. So,
Okay.
And the only thing that changed was like one side would still kind of slope out, and then the other side would just be a little bit flatter. So it's still hard to pick up. Like, and that's like a second gen or next gen blob is what most people refer to. There was a middle blue blob in between, where like York produced a line of like blue dumbbells that were in like sporting goods stores, but they didn't produce nearly as many of them, and they're a lot more rare to find. But that next gen blob, the casting for it was just a little bit sharper edge on one side, and it didn't slope out as much. So they continued to make dumbbells, but for whatever reason, with the foundry or the company, they switched the casting process, and it changed the shape of the dumbbell a little bit, and they weren't quite as wide. And one more thing to note is like the reason a lot of Fat Man blobs weigh 52 and 54 pounds,
Okay.
even though they're half 100s, is because a lot of those dumbbells were overweight. So a lot of those dumbbells were 104 to 108 pounds, and then you cut them in half. That's why they come out heavy. So that's why the Fat Man blobs are more challenging. They're heavier, the slopes are bigger, and when you get into like the 50-pound blobs that are next gen blobs, they're typically right around 50 pounds on the dot. So maybe York was trying to be more precise with their measurements and they shave stuff down. I don't know. That's a theory I'm making up on spot. But the original line of bells was kind of overweight generally, and that's why the Fat Man blob is generally way over 50 pounds. And next gen blobs are like 50 point something or 49.8. They're like right there where they should be. So
And where does the legacy blobs like stand in this like timeline of blobs? It's like
they would be
after.
after all those. Yeah, after all those. I could be wrong. There's better resources than me for this. But like the old York Roundheads were probably produced like 70s and 80s. The next gen probably started getting produced in the 90s, and then the legacies were probably produced sometime in the 2000s. You know,
So
to give you a timeline, kind of through that 30 to 40 year period. And like before the Roundheads, there was like what York called the bun style dumbbells, and they had the globe dumbbells. So there's like globes, like there's York globes that are completely like circular.
yes.
Then there's like the bun dumbbells that are like a little more oval, and then they went to the Roundheads, which are like the famous ones that the blobs come from. And then they got to the legacies, was like the last line of them. So yeah, I don't know the exact dates, but that's my best guess.
Perfect. And I know that you have like many blobs in your collection.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, have you had those blobs from Japan, the KWN or something?
Yeah, I had some. I sold them to Ben Helms, so I don't own any anymore. Ben has all the KWN blobs from Japan, but I lifted the 55-pound one that they had, which was very hard because the slopes are very big on them. They have really great texture, but the slopes on them are hard. It's kind of like the slopes of a Fat Man, or uh yeah, just like both sides are pretty fat, and it's a hard pinch to do. So lifting that KWN 55-pound blob was one of the tougher blobs I've ever lifted. Even though I've lifted heavier ones, that shape was tough. And I thought that the 60-pound blob by KWN, the Japan whatever blob, I thought the 60 was kind of so far out of reach that I was like, I don't even want to think about this thing right now. And I sold that to Ben.
But are those like created because of the Fatman
Yeah,
blob? Are those like replicas, right?
yeah. It's kind of their version of blobs. Now they don't none of those sizes are exact replicas to a Fat Man. The
Okay.
closest one to the Fat Man would probably be the 50-pound blob, but even then it kind of comes in maybe a little thin. So none of them are accurate replicas of a Fat Man blob, but that's what that probably was. That was their attempt at kind of creating their own, increments for blob training.
And how could one obtain a KWN blob? Are like do they like have a web page where you can buy the things, or it's like harder?
It's tough. It's the same deal like with Joe messaging me and then me getting him a blob. It's like you almost have to know somebody internationally. So there was a couple of the Japanese kind of block weight and blob lifters
Yes.
that me and Ben had kind of talked to pretty regularly, and that was kind of how we worked it out. Where like, hey, I'll send you money through PayPal, and and it's like it's somebody in Japan, so like, yeah, we're talking online, but like they could easily take my money, and then I never see a blob. Um, so it's a bit of a risk, but yeah, so we just felt that like through some of the messaging and stuff, we wanted the blobs that bad. We went ahead and kind of worked with people that could get them. So basically what would happen is we'd have somebody in Japan that would buy the blob. We PayPal, cover the shipping, whatever, and then they would just ship it internationally to us. So it wasn't directly from the company. It was kind of like secondhand, or they buy it first and then they ship it to us. But it's just knowing people and who you talk to. But like I said, I don't own any anymore. And Ben has, I think, the 50, 55, and the 60. So Ben has a three-piece set of those blobs that are pretty challenging, pretty challenging blobs and pretty cool blobs. You know, anytime there's a blob that's not like the original York ones, but it's like a good kind of replica that's like been cast. It's cool to get your hands on, just because there's not a whole lot of them. You know, and to know that there's like other countries that are making them in foundries, and it's like actually a thing they're doing. That's cool as well. You know, I mean, we don't even have that in the U.S. really. It's rumored that Rogue is doing blobs or something, but I haven't
Yeah.
seen anything with that too much. But so who knows? That guy could turn out to be good, or I don't know. Maybe it'll never turn into anything. I'll believe it when I start seeing more blobs out there. But the fact that there's a foundry in Japan that makes inch dumbbells and block weights was like really interesting to me and Ben, and we thought that those were so rare, and we just wanted to get them and lift them and just see what it was about. And I lifted the 55-pound one, and the 60 was just one that wasn't going to be happening anytime soon. And Ben lifted the 60 the first time he came over, and he picked it up with both hands and certified on that. Yeah, it's actually it's 60 pounds, but it's a little over. It's about 61, maybe 62 pounds, and it's probably harder to lift than Blobzilla,
Whoa.
depending on your hand size. For Ben, it's harder. It's easier for Ben to lift Blobzilla than it is his 60-pound KWN. So I haven't even lifted Blobzilla yet. That's why I was like, you can go ahead and take that KWN with you. And when I get to that point, I'll mess with it another day. But yeah.
And what about blobs from Nathan? Have you tried one? Do you have any in your collection?
Yeah. Yeah, I have a 24 kg one, which is kind of his Fat Man replica. And yeah, I have a 24 kg replica, and it's I want to say it comes out to, if I weighed it in actual pounds on my scale, like 54 pounds. So it's right about like what the heavy range of a Fat Man would be. The edges of it are wider than a Fat Man, and
Okay.
the slopes are a little bit skinnier. Depending on your hand size, you might find the Hall blob easier than a Fat Man. For me, because of the width and where it puts my hand, I think they're slightly harder to lift than a Fat Man. But because our hands vary and the angles of the blobs vary, people have different opinions. Like there's blobs that Ben will say, I think this is harder than that one. And I'm like, I don't think so. It's different for each person. So, but it's close to a Fat Man. Like they're comparable for the 24 kg Hall blob. They're, like I said, the dimensions are a little different, but difficulty wise, they're in the same ballpark.
Okay. I remember like years ago, before I went out from college, uh, I saw blobs online, and I remember that they were not as expensive as these days. And I wanted to ask you, do you know what happened that it was like a hype for the blobs? Was it like related
Uh,
to Brian Shaw and Yuji Mufu making blob videos, and then the
it could
prices
be.
went up? How was it?
It could be a little bit of that, and then so yeah, I mean that's obviously exposing it to more people. So then maybe the demand slightly goes up. But there's also a lot of people that, I mean, they have weights sitting around, and it's like, I don't know. I mean, I've seen several cases where people like have wanted to buy dumbbells. They're like, man, I really want to buy that set of 90-pound York dumbbells. And the seller's like, I can make twice as much money if I blob them. So I'm going to cut them and blob them. So I think if there wasn't that demand there for it, then obviously no one would cut them. If it was going to, like, you know what I mean? If you were going to make less by cutting them, people wouldn't cut them. But people are making more if they cut them and sell them as blobs than if they sell them as actual full dumbbells. So I think for some of these vintage weight collectors that don't mind cutting up some of their stuff, or for people that are like newer to it and they see the prices, because I think there's a lot of people that they're not blob lifters, and I don't think they're vintage weights collectors. They're like not associated with either group, but they see the blobs and they see the crazy prices, and then they get their hands on the dumbbells and they say, oh, I'm going to make some money real quick. And then they start sawing everything up thinking that they're just going to get that $450, $500 sale. And it's like, dude, none of those things should be that expensive. So like I said, I think maybe some demand increase, maybe some from some popularity videos and stuff going out there a little bit, but people just constantly driving the price up a little bit, and then they get a little more rare. People are willing to pay a little more, and then people just keep taking advantage. And like I said, you got people that are most of the time when people are selling them. I'll tell you this. This will be my statement on it. Probably 99% of the time I've ever seen a Fat Man blob listed or any heavy blob listed for $350+. So we're talking like, I can understand if, when I got into grip, they were all about, if you put it up for auction and let the people decide the price, it would usually run up to $300 or a little over. So that's kind of what the price is. If that's what all the people are bidding, that's kind of what the price is, But for you to list it as that without the auction or the people saying that's the price, and you just say, oh, this is $450. I don't know that that's accurate. So for those kind of people, when it's not an auction and they labeled the price at like $450 or $500 for a blob, I can almost guarantee you they've never lifted it. That's pretty much true. 99% of the time. If somebody is selling you a blob for $350+, they probably don't know shit about blobs, and they definitely can't lift the one they're selling you, because the guys that lift them and actually know stuff about them, they're not ripping people off like that. So, yeah. But why is the price high? People just trying to cash out. And like I said, what are you going to do with that? Gas money for the week? You're gonna go out to a restaurant, get you and somebody else dinner for $60, gas for the week. Okay, there's your extra money you made off that blob. Like, these people act like they're going to retire off of it or something. Like, oh, I can't. I'm going to hold out and sell this blob for $500. Like, for what? What are you going to do? What are you going to do with that $150? But it's their property. It's their right to sell it for whatever they want. But I'm just being critical of it. Like, just want them to know that their prices are kind of stupid. And like I said, usually it's somebody that can't lift it. So that's why they're listing it that way. They just want money.